Many years ago there was a fantastic turnout of people here on the banks of the River Nith and throughout Dumfries and beyond. They'd all come to watch the celebrated aeronaut Charles Green take off in his magnificent balloon from the yard at the King's Arms Hotel. Now people were jostling to get a better view. One of those was a Mrs. Patterson. Now Mrs. Patterson was described as a respectable woman between the age of 50 and 60, and she had a wee shop in the town's English Street. She'd spent the day washing, and as such she was ready for a rest, so she stood for a couple of hours and relaxed and watched Charles Green and his balloon. But the very next day, the 15th day of September 1832, Mrs. Patterson would be struck down by the disease. Mrs. Patterson was the very first person in Dumfries to die of cholera during the 1832 epidemic. Now there was a number of stories and myths came about at the time. People were even saying that the doctors were poisoning the wells of the town. Others said that when Charles made his great ascent in the balloon, that he brought the pestilence, the disease, back down to earth with him.
During the cholera outbreak, shops closed at noon, schools were shut, and even the pubs, landlords, were told to close at dusk. The cattle market down at the White Sands, which was normally bustling with folk, was completely deserted. It was like a ghost town.
We're standing here at the Cholera Memorial in St Michael's churchyard. It's sometimes known as the Cholera Mound. We visit quite often to pay our respects to the 420 souls who are buried here. It was very different to the plague pits where people were just piled in on top of one another. All of these souls were in their own individual coffins. So as you can imagine, there would be an awful lot of work going on in the town to try and keep up with the great demand.
Now, it was as early as 1765 that plans were drawn up to supply fresh water to the town of Dumfries. However, the decision wasn't finally made until 1850. Now, during the first cholera epidemic in 1832, it was put down to poor hygiene in the lower classes and also, strangely enough, lack of religious faith. However, in the epidemic in 1848, things were very much different when the middle classes were affected as much as the lower classes. It was soon found out that water was to play the part in why people came down with the epidemic. In the end of 1850, it was announced officially that fresh water would come to the town of Dumfries. Bonfires were lit, bells were rung, and there was great rejoicing in the streets at that announcement. Here we are at Loch Rutten Loch, about 10 miles from Dumfries. It was on the 16th of January 1850 that work commenced on the supply of fresh water to Dumfries. But what did this entail? Well, the first thing that had to be carried out was the building of an intake valve house. Now, the intake valve would determine how much water went along the pipe to Dumfries, the flow of the water, the pressure of the water. And this was controlled from the intake house. About 2 miles downstream, we had 2 slow sand filters. Now, the slow sand filters would take in the raw water from the loch and make it into drinkable water. The filters would filter all the bad, nasty things out of the water and make it drinkable. And that is how the water got here from Loch Rutten to the fountain in Dumfries.
On the 21st of October 1851, that was the day that Dumfries finally received its water supply from Loch Rutten. On the day of the opening ceremony, the mid-steeple bells pealed loudly, the Annan brass band played out in the street, and flags were flying high. At the ceremony, when Provost Nicholson arrived, it wasn't without incident. When he went up to turn on the valve, the water shot up into the air and came down, soaking himself and also all the bystanders that were nearby. You can just picture the scene.